There, we're live somewhere. Over the rainbow. There's a way to copy the link. Hey, look, there's the link. Scott, now you can see the link in my browser.
Now I can see the link. I feel so
I will
special.
give you the link to our live stream. Hopefully all our audio levels are the same. It has been so long since we have done this that we're all out of whack.
I'm going to blame your setup.
As we sit here quietly now, waiting for audio to come through.
Yep,
all right, I think audio levels are good.
Yep.
Yeah.
Confirmed.
Hey, look at that. It only took us, what time is it? 9:30. We were supposed to start this an hour ago. And here we are.
When I came to do this tonight, my wife rolled her eyes when I said we were going to be done in an hour. I'm just going to throw that out there for you.
We started in an hour. Is that close enough?
No. I'm going to get a lot of legitimate eye rolling when I get back out into the other part of the house.
The other part of the house. Yeah, you know what? This is what happens. It's been a long time. We haven't streamed one of these in 2 or 3 months. Summer vacations, all of that. And hopefully as we get back into this, it will get a little bit more seamless. We keep saying that. Today, I did discover that issue today, though. Apparently, we use Ecamm to stream to YouTube, and I use OneDrive for a bunch of stuff. It appears, initial diagnosis over the last 30 minutes we were trying to do this, was that there's some weird conflict going on between Ecamm and OneDrive. I don't know if it's where Ecamm is storing some temporary files and the location OneDrive is trying to sync to, or something like that. I am using known folder move on my Mac. End of the day, once I killed OneDrive, Ecamm started working significantly better.
Lo and behold, the application that writes to local storage and uploads at the same time, combined with an application that reads local storage and uploads at the same time, might not be a good mix. But hey, here we are. We're all up. We're ready to go. And today we're going to chat PowerShell and REST APIs, like the best of no worlds.
And Microsoft Graph and all of that. So I'm going to start with this particular screen that I have up. Hopefully it works. Azure AD. So this is kind of what prompted this. I write a lot of PowerShell, and it's been a lot of Microsoft 365, SharePoint, but as a result, I also write a lot against Azure AD. And there are currently a plethora of modules out there in various stages. I would say there's the old Microsoft Online module, MSOL, that I think has been deprecated, but probably exists in various forms on the internet yet, for reading and writing stuff to Azure AD. And then we have this Azure AD module for reading and writing stuff to Azure AD. You also have kind of what would come after this. There's also an Azure AD preview module. And then there was this announcement that this Azure AD module is planned for deprecation. The deprecation update, I think, is that it's actually deprecating really soon. This was March 1. Do you know the date that this was deprecating? Here's the MSOL, December 2022.
Yeah, I believe it's all the end of this calendar year, kind of 2022 being this calendar year. It's kind of been fuzzy for when certain things come and certain things go. But by the end of this year, you definitely have to be ready for this transition. I think there's a couple other things that are happening maybe a little bit earlier, depending on what you do. So for example, if you are doing license management using the Azure AD PowerShell modules that exist today, then that might not work out very well for you in in the future, like in even the near term. You might want to think about transitioning some of that stuff over. So you land in a world where you're using, instead of say like the Azure AD license management PowerShell commandlets, that you're using something like the graph even earlier than the end of this year, just in case things break a little bit early.
Yeah, and that's what I've started to do. So all of my new PowerShell, and that's that good example, is because of this planned deprecation. All of my my new PowerShell, I'm writing using the graph, using the new graph module um, to do licensing, to update users, to make changes to users. I am going to have to go back and actually update a bunch of old PowerShell I wrote as well. Tell us what you think. No, I'm not going to tell you what I think. That is using the Azure AD module. Some of it I actually had using the Azure AD preview module because there's certain things in there that never made it to the Azure AD module. But end of the day, if you do have PowerShell using Azure AD module or you write any new stuff, you really want to do it with Microsoft Graph PowerShell.
Yeah, certainly if you're starting out today, like that's the way that you are going to want to go. There's really no other way around it. It's going to be extremely painful. It's not going to be fun in any way, shape, or form. Especially if you're using, unfortunately, like existing documentation, just the stuff that's out there right now. I think it's just not in a great state given where things are going to be. So lots of blogs that you read on the internet. I'll even throw like Microsoft documentation in here, like docs.microsoft.com
Yeah.
stuff.
Here, and
There may
you
or
had
there
an
may, or may not
example.
be a yeah. There may
Like,
or may
here,
not
let's
be a
flip over to your
date.
screen.
Sure. So let's just go to like, hey, the very first thing that I want to do is I want to connect to my Microsoft 365 tenant using PowerShell. And like off the cuff, this all looks okay. Like, hey, I'm going to come in, I'm going to connect to my tenancy. How am I going to do that? I am going to use the Azure Active Directory PowerShell for Graph module. So, well, hold on. Those are commandlets that include Azure AD in their name. So that's a little weird. So then you hop down to that heading and you see the very first thing it does is install your required software. And your required software is the Azure AD module, which is just the same old Azure AD module that's been out there all along. So if you go down this path and you read this article and you go, oh, great, there's a module called Azure AD and that manages Azure AD, which you would think like, hey, that all makes sense. Like off the top of my head, like, yeah, that feels right. And we'll go ahead and we'll connect that up and we'll do a little bit of connect to Azure AD. And then what can we do once we're there? Oh, look, we can do things like we can connect to the MSOL service and maybe do license management that way. Like get MSOL license. The reality is this stuff is like woefully out of date. Like we talked about, like, hey, the end of this year is coming up fast. If you followed this article and you went through these steps and you did all these things, every single commandlet that you used, I think, as an example in here, would be broken by the end of this year. Like, I love this. It's actually using the MS Online module. Like, this is just not right. And then you do things, you say like, and if you knew like, okay, maybe this doesn't pass the sniff test, I need to find out how to do something else. Then you start going over like, well, how do I get started with this thing that everybody calls graph? So then maybe you start going and reading that documentation, and you'll see all of a sudden that there's all these commandlets that don't have Azure AD or MSOL or anything like that in their names. They are all MG Graph, Microsoft Graph, Microsoft Graph.
Right.
Graph?
I was gonna.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask that. Like, what is the G for an MG? Because this is the
I
Microsoft Graph. Shouldn't it just be mgraph or mg?
there's probably some weird naming rule for PowerShell, or some marketer had fun with it. But yeah, you start to see that MG graph is kind of your preferred context for working with these things, because all of a sudden going from something like get msol user or msol user rather, I just kind of shorthand that to msol all the time in my head, turns
Yep.
into get mg user. Totally different commandlet. It's going to have a totally different set. Like, some things will map over the same, but it's going to have a different set of properties that's returned on the commandlet when you go ahead and run it. Heck, just the way in general these things run, like the fact that to talk to the graph, you need an application inside of Azure AD. That application needs a set of assigned permissions to it, particularly things like directory.read and user.read. You're going to probably want to be able to read mailboxes. Like, there's tons of things that you're going to want to do from the context of the graph that you're just going to kind of need to get up to speed with. So to get back to your point of, you have existing PowerShell commandlets or PowerShell scripts that use what are kind of considered, I guess, legacy commandlets at this point, and legacy
Yep.
modules, really, for lack of a better term. You're going to need to transition those over to using the graph. Your mileage will vary greatly with the success you have in doing that, based on existing documentation today, be that documentation from Microsoft, documentation from the community. Like, there's a bunch of MVPs who are super passionate about this. Like, the first place I would go is like go read like I think it's Practical 365. Like, Tony Redmond is an MVP who's very passionate about PowerShell in general, and then throw in this whole Azure AD graph kind of transition in there. They have a whole Git repo with up-to-date examples and things like that might help you along the way in your journey, as it were.
Yeah. And while we're in this documentation too, well, you have it up. One of my favorite pages, they actually have at least one good piece of documentation in here. If you expand out that migrate to Microsoft Graph PowerShell menu item on the left side there, that's like two from the bottom.
Yep.
And then that commandlet map, the second one.
Yep.
This is a page that, as I go through it, I use all the time. Because this does go in and at least show, well, it maybe isn't a one-for-one map of parameters that have changed or output that's going to differ. It at least gives you what Microsoft was thinking as they transition from Azure AD to the Microsoft Graph, and which commandlets map, how they map, or if they map
or
at all,
just
because you'll
don't map.
see,
Like
right, like it
application
just doesn't
proxy
exist.
connector, nothing. Yeah, that'll be fun.
Because there's a few of them. Like, I think set mg user is one where it changed from like update. I don't know if it was update AD user or set AD or set Azure AD user, or one of those switches. Like, some of those sets switch to updates. There's one set Azure AD user extension is now update mg user extension. So it's not always that one-for-one mapping where Azure AD just changed to MG, but sometimes a set turned to an update, or add turned to something else. And there's a few of those where you actually see they took two Azure AD commandlets and mashed them into a single one. So maybe where you had a set and a add before, or like I think that would be it, like an add and a set. Now they've both mashed into an update or something like that. So using this map, if you have written Azure AD PowerShell before, you have all your commandlets, you want to go figure out what you need to do to write it in Microsoft Graph, I just go to this page, hit Control F, and do a search for the commandlet I'm currently using to figure out at least the commandlet I need to go look at the documentation for, to figure out how to start transitioning that Azure AD PowerShell into Microsoft Graph PowerShell. And you'll notice if
Yeah,
you go down, it even
that's
has
a
the
good tip.
MSOL
I'd
ones.
actually never seen this page before. Like, this is great. I use like in my day to day role, just service maps in general. So like I spend a lot of time in S3 and Azure Land, or like
Okay,
S3, AWS, and Azure Land with a lot of my customers. So I spend a lot of time in like the AWS service maps to Azure. So I think
got
like
it.
documentation like this, as long as it's accurate, is really good.
Yeah, and so far to date, I found this to be pretty accurate. And again, I like that it has both Azure AD and the MSOL commandlets on here too. So if you're even still writing MSOL stuff, that Microsoft MS Online, it has that map too down at the bottom. So yeah, this is, once you get writing it, this is my go-to for my documentation. So do you want to get in and play with it and see how you start setting some of this up and get going with
Yeah,
it?
let's take a look.
All right. So this is, you found one set of documentation. I'm curious what Microsoft was thinking as they wrote.
Do you want to go take a look at that real quick?
Do you want to show?
So
Yeah, show that
yeah,
documentation that you found.
yeah. So inside the Microsoft Graph docs, and I think this again just speaks to kind of how disjointed this stuff is based on how you maybe find your way into it. Like, Google, Bing, DuckDuckGo, you're probably getting in a bunch of different ways, and you might be landing on a different set of documentation, like your peer who, sits in the virtual cubicle next to you. But this is a tutorial that walks you through how to build PowerShell scripts with the Microsoft Graph, which off the cuff, like you think, hey, that's kind of exactly what I want to do, even before I'm transitioning from Azure AD over to MG Graph. I've got to just figure out like what MG Graph is in the first place, and kind of how that comes together. So this walks you through a little bit of a weird flow. Like if you go and you land on other documentation for the Microsoft Graph, there's some kind of automation in the background that does things like registering an app in Azure AD for you, making sure that that app has the right permissions against it. Like there's auto magic stuff that can happen along the way, but this tutorial assumes that none of that auto magic stuff is in place, and it takes you down this what I think, like when I showed you, you said like this is just weird. Like, why would you do this? So it takes you down the traditional path of I'm a developer. I think like when I looked at this, like it was much more application developer centric. Like these are things that I would do to register a custom application within my directory. What are the types of things that I want this application to be able to do? Once my Azure AD application is created, I'm going to do those things like retrieve the client ID for it, the tenant that it's authorized against, and I'm going to assign it some permissions. So like, hey, what are the scopes that are going to be available to this particular application? And you'll see, like in this case, it's just connecting to the graph rather than as a user, as that client ID. What's the tenant I auth to? What are the scopes I'm looking for in context of that connection? And then just kind of goes through the regular device authorization flow. And then once you're in there, it walks you through, hey, do things like examine your context. Maybe since you had the scopes, at least as far as the tutorial went, of things like user.read, great, you can read users and enumerate over users in the directory. How do you make all that work? So it just kind of walks you step by step through those kinds of things based on this very narrow set of constraints that have been put in place just by the tutorial itself, by virtue of saying like, hey, these are the scopes that I'm going to connect with. Walks you through app-only authentication, how to list users in your directory, like all good stuff. Obviously ends with a add your own code little piece to it. which I kind of laugh at, but I think it's also important to call out. Like, there are things that you are going to want to do with the graph, like when it comes to rough edges around it, that you are going to need to use REST APIs for. So you're probably going to want to be familiar with things like maybe Graph Explore and playing with that and understanding how these URIs to these various REST endpoints are constructed. And am I doing gets, am I doing posts, am I doing patches, like what are the particular like context of what I'm firing off, to get all that going. And then finally, congratulations, like you're done. You've done the tutorial, and now you've got a
You've
working
made it.
app. Yeah, that can call the graph. Not exactly a repeatable kind of thing, unless you want to keep going back and using that same app with that same kind of scoped set of permissions that it had, or you figure out how to add more permissions next time you run through that tutorial, anything like that.
Yeah, and when you showed me that, I was like, wow, I didn't even go down that route. That's not the way I went about executing all of it. And I will say, looking through that, it's probably good to look through, and it might be helpful to understand what's going on in the background. But if you're just getting started with this, I would say you absolutely don't need to worry about all of that.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna
Now, like you're better off going over here, maybe to that other documentation of just like, hey, here's Graph PowerShell. How do you get started with it? Great. We need to install it, and that's kind of just, hey, we're going out to PS Gallery. We're doing the install, all those kinds of things. Now I'm ready to use it. How do I use it? What are the permissions that I'm going to get? Like, I think this is just a more straightforward way to do it. You'll notice, like the example here, connect MG graph is just going to automatically sign in with just the scopes, versus the command of that tutorial, which was going to use that application registration that you had pre-created and was already available in your directory. You knew the client ID for it, all those kinds of things.
right, and that's the way I would go about it. So let's jump over and let's play with it, and I'll show you some things in one of my tenants as we've played with this. So, like you said, I'm going to go grab. Oh, look, that started working again. Random stuff on my computer just starts working. So jumping over, and you'll notice the first thing is that requirement of 5.1 or later. This does work on a Mac. So if I go launch, I run the PowerShell preview, because what fun is it if you don't run the preview of pretty much everything?
Of course.
Yeah, so I'm logged in. I do already have that module installed. But if you haven't, it's just that install, like you said, it's install module. We can do a whole tab complete, because I love my tab completes, and Microsoft Graph. And this will go out to that gallery, grab the Microsoft Graph module, go ahead and get that installed. The one thing I will say that is probably the biggest transition that I have found is the scopes that you were talking about, in terms of giving permission to the application, being able to figure all that out. You'll notice the tenant I'm actually going to go against once we start doing this is this Navuba tenant that I have. I have some of these enterprise applications listed already, some provisioning stuff, some Power BI stuff. I do have the PNP Office 365 management modules, but I don't have any of the Azure AD stuff out there. So hopefully this will install. And the first thing that I did when I went and started using this was exactly what you showed, where I'd maybe go out and I'd want to connect to MG Graph. And it will go ahead and try to connect. It'll pop open a new browser window, let me sign in. I'm going to go ahead and sign in with this account, and it starts asking for permissions. Permission requested, that Graph PowerShell. It wants to at least sign in and read my profile information, maintain access to data, I'm just going to go ahead and consent on behalf of your organization and accept. Authentication complete, great, all well and good. We're connected. Welcome to the Microsoft Graph. The first thing we're
So
going to do.
just a quick note
Yeah,
there,
go ahead.
on the consent piece, these are all admin consent requirements. So you are going to need an administrator within that tenancy to go ahead and approve those. And that's no different than like if you wanted to maybe get started in the Graph Explorer before you came over and started doing the PowerShell side of things. Like same thing, you need to authenticate like Graph Explorer as an application, or in this case, your kind of PowerShell context over to your tenancy. So you were able to get through that flow pretty quickly because you have rights within that tenancy to grant that admin consent. But if like we went over to another tenant, like and I was trying to do the same thing and I didn't have permissions in there, it's gonna just kind of yell at me and say, sorry, no, go find an admin who can get you what you need.
Yeah, that's a good call out, because I had this when we were working with a client the other day, where we were used to being able to go and like connect Azure AD or connect to something. And as long as you had a certain level of admin rights, you were able to just go start running the PowerShell. But the admin rights to maybe connect to Azure AD and retrieve users is not as high of a permission as you need to approve an enterprise application and grant access to certain scopes. And if you don't get all the scopes you need right away, there can be some back and forth in order to actually get all those permissions granted that you need with somebody high enough to go in and approve all of that. It's a little, in some cases, it's a lot more work to go in and grant all of those right permissions, because even though I'm a global admin and I just connected with a global admin and approve those permissions, if I go try to do like a get mg user, it actually goes in and fails because I have insufficient privileges to complete the operation.
Back to that whole scopes thing. Like, do you have user.read.all? And now are you able to do that mapping in your head of what permissions or effectively like what scopes do I actually need to perform the set of operations that I want to perform within the context of this connection specifically? Yeah, it starts to get really weird really quick.
There is one out there. It's in the documentation here, where they talk about it as you start using it, determining those scopes, this find mg graph command. And I would get very familiar with this, save this in a clipboard somewhere, where you can use this find mg graph command, pass it in the command you want to use, pipe that to select -first one, expand property permissions. And this will give you this type of output of all of the scopes that are available that can be used, or the scope permission that can be used to grant that mg user permission level. So in this case, if I go throw that over there, and I'm actually going to delete off the pipe, what you're looking for with this find mg graph command is that pipe is actually going through and getting all of these permissions here underneath this get mg users. If you just do the find graph command, you'll see a lot of those different methods too that it's using. It's using a get method. It's going to this user's endpoint or the user's user ID endpoint. So you can get more of that information about the command. If truly all you're looking for is just that permission level, you can go write that permission level. So as long as I'm granted that device management apps, directory read all, directory read write all, one of these scopes I'll be able to use this get mg user command. Um,
Within the within the scope that command has been granted. So like this is, I think, where it starts to get maybe a little weird is depending on what you want to do. Like if you're not doing something that requires, say, like management of Intune devices, you don't need to
uh-huh,
pipe in and grant yourself the scope for device management. Like if all you want to do is
right.
get users, you can do user.read.all and you're good, ready to go. You don't need that other kind of permission on top of it. This is the kind of, the whole kitchen when maybe all you need is just one or two pots or pans out of the cabinet kind of thing.
Right. And where it starts getting tricky, this I would say is the other aspect to this is now let's say I want to get an MG user and I want to start working with my users, but I also want to go start working with groups in Azure AD. If I want to work with a group, I can do it with directory read all, directory read write all, which are two of those permissions up here. Or I can do a group read all, and I could do a user read all. So at this point in time, based on the commandlets that end up going into my PowerShell script that I'm writing, do I grant a bunch of different scopes, or do I go find the least common denominator that applies to all of them? In terms of maybe I just grant directory read all so that I don't have to go in and grant both a user read all and a group read all. And now I
I
want
don't
to
think
go
I've
start
seen
writing to
like
groups.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen good guidance out there on what that actually looks like. Like lots of the examples, they tend to flip flop between the more constrained permission set versus the wider permission set.
Yeah, and I don't see this is one of them. It used to be set
Update.
group. I think now it's update MG group, where if I'm doing an update, now I need to have that read write all. So going back to now I've started to figure out what is that permission level I need. I can go in and grant it. Before I do that, let's jump back to enterprise integration or enterprise applications. You'll actually see now that I refresh this, I have this Microsoft Graph PowerShell. And I get the spinning beach ball. It's all starting to melt. Application. So this is where when you showed me that process of going through and registering the application, I was like, I've never had to do that because that initial
I just go down this
connection,
path. Yeah.
right, goes and starts doing it already. So I could go start looking at permissions, and this is where that access is denied, where I do have that user read. This one in theory should have, I think I can maybe just read my own profile with this one. I can't read everybody
Correct.
else's. It's
Yeah.
not a
Yeah.
directory. It's
So you can
just
go to like
my
you can go to
user.
the me endpoint, but you can't go to say like the overall users endpoint kind of
Right.
thing.
So it's just granted those initial permissions. In order to get the rest of those, what I can do is I can actually go back to my connect, and one of the parameters that I can pass in now is this scopes. So we have started determining that in order to get my users, I need this user read all. And I'm going to grab that one. And you can pass in multiple scopes. So I can do a user read all. And let's say I know I don't need a directory read all. I just want users and groups. If I go grab these, and I can pass in multiple scopes, put the comma, I don't even know what word that is. It's comma delimited, comma
The delimiter. Yes.
delineation, delimiter, the comma delineation. It's not delineation. Put a comma in there and do another connect. This will prompt that login dialog, prompt another tab, And now when I go log in this time, I actually have a lot more permissions that it will ask me to consent to
Yeah, so
eventually.
it's, I guess that's the other thing with the permissioning and kind of the admin consents is it's really a consent per permission. So like every time you pass in a new permission that you don't have consent to, and that hasn't been granted that admin consent, so like you've got the auth box up there, and hey, I'm going to consent on behalf of my organization kind of thing. Every single one of those that's new that hasn't been granted to that application, that Azure AD Enterprise application, the registered app, then you've got to go through this flow every time. So you might want to account for that in, say, like automation. Like this probably isn't something you've ever really had to, I certainly didn't think about these things with like the Azure AD commandlets. Like, hey, I'm going to write this script that manages onboarding new users, doing initial license assignment, all those kinds of things. What are all the permissions that I need to be able to do that on day one so I can go grant consent to all of those at once? Because if I miss one or a new one is added or something like that, all of a sudden your whole automation just kind of blows up. Like it can't run anymore.
Exactly. And that's what I've hit. Or you want to go add something new to your automation. You have to remember that you can't just add it. You have to go make sure that those permissions are there. So that authentication completed. If I go refresh this now, once it actually takes effect, there it goes. You'll see now I can read all users for full profiles. I can read all groups. So if I go back to my PowerShell window now, this time if I do the get MG user, it actually has those permissions to go hit that endpoint, go and grab all of those different users out of that tenant. Same thing, I went in and I'm able to get my groups now, so I can see all of those. But as soon as I would go in and try to update an MG group, it's going to ask for group ID and some other stuff here. Where's a group ID I can use? It's not going to be able to update them because I only granted those read permissions. So to your point, now I'd have to go back in.
It's like playing whack-a-mole. Just
but I didn't try to update anything. What can I update on a group? Probably the name. Is there a name parameter on there? Mail, team, OneNote. We'll make it mail enabled. Mail enabled, true. Mail enabled isn't a Boolean, it's just a dash. Ooh, maybe it's letting me update it, which would be odd. It shouldn't. Yeah, because I didn't grant read write to the groups, I don't think. But that gets to that point of as you go through and do all these different things, you may have to go in and change those scopes, adjust those. The nice thing is once you add them, the next time I would go through and connect, because consent has already been granted, I'm not going to have to go in and pass those scopes through every time.
Yeah, just don't go delete that application registration.
Right. So if I would do, for example, disconnect MG graph, I log out, I'd try to get MG users now. I'm not connected. Authentication is needed. So this time I could just go through and I could do a connect MG graph. It's still going to walk me through potentially that prompt. It may pick up that I already logged in. We'll have to see what happens here. Yep, sign in again, pick my account again, give my password again. I don't get any prompts. I'm not asking for any new scopes. All the scopes that I didn't pass in any new scopes, so it's not prompting for any. I already have those scopes that I used in the past, so I could go do that get MG user again. and it would go grant them all. I'm not going to have to go, like I said, I don't have to go re-request those. I already have them. They've already been granted. So the other option is with this is you go find that highest scope level. This is by far probably not security best practice. Grant the highest scope level
Probably
and say,
not.
I'm done with this, forget about it. I don't have to worry about it anymore because I've granted every possible right to that graph PowerShell.
Yeah. Directory, read, write all. So those are going to be your friends.
Exactly. So for me, that's how I've gotten started. The scopes and figuring that out is, I would say, by far the trickiest part. My thought is always, from a security perspective, in Microsoft would, while their examples may differ, Microsoft by and large, when you go take any certification exams or you talk to them, it's always follow the least permissive principle, which would be only going through and granting those particular scopes that you need as you need them. Don't just give directory read write all because it's the easiest thing to do.
Yeah. I think like the overarching permissions are good, especially when you're playing around in the beginning, just to get a feel for how have the commandlets change, how have the parameter sets, like all those kinds of things. Like, what do I need to do to get to where I want to be? And then once you've maybe figured out those pieces and you haven't spent maybe as much time as you would have banging your head against the wall, then you can kind of come back and figure out like, okay, how do I take this thing out of this environment and put it into my real environment along the way. We did an earlier stream about how to get started with your first dev tenant. Like, dev tenants are great for this kind of thing. Like, let me get in and play around. Especially in context. So like, just for example, on the screen right now, you have, hey, let's get started with graph PowerShell. And one of the examples has this commandlet where it's getting a user where the display name equals Megan Brown. Megan Brown's one of the default users in a in those CDX tenants or in those developer tenants that come up if you deploy the user pack. So your life might actually be a little bit easier if you go grab one of those, deploy one of those, spin all that up, do all the nasty permissioning things, like the worst practice of, hey, I want to be a deity in this environment, all that, and then take all those over to your real environment. That's where your kind of more constrained set of permissions can be put into place. Like, once you've, I think, done the hard part of it, which is actually figuring out what are the new commandlets, what are the new parameter sets, does the logic work in a similar way for what I needed it to do in the past? Like, what if I Frankenstein together here now, and then, stand that up over maybe in your real tenant?
Yeah, I would agree. And I do the same thing. Like, the tenant we've been playing in today is a tenant. I actually pay for a couple licenses just to have a tenant that's always there, that I can play with. But you're right. CDX tenants, most of these examples, I was looking through the rest of this example too when you mentioned that I know Adele, Alex, these are all
Yeah,
users that are in
they're all good
those CDX
friends. Yeah,
tenants.
Alan. Yep.
Yep. And it does. This is where I would start with this overview of the Microsoft Graph PowerShell. We'll put this down in the video description, and just going through the installation and then all these different examples. I know yours, I don't remember how many examples they had in that documentation you showed, but this goes through, again, getting users, listing a team the users join to, looking at the team channel, sending messages to the team channel, going and signing out. I think this is going to be something that in the future you're going to have to get really familiar with. The only one I've seen deprecated so far is Azure AD, but kind of reading between the lines when it starts looking at teams you're joined to and even channels, sending a message to the channel. This is all stuff that maybe would be in the Microsoft Teams PowerShell. I know even from a development perspective, Microsoft is starting to try to roll everything into Graph. I can imagine that eventually it's just going to be the Microsoft Graph PowerShell for everything related to SharePoint, to Teams, to Azure AD. Uh, you just go
Yeah, I
install this one
imagine
module
that
and do everything.
that's kind of the way it goes. There's actually a way we can kind of show graphically what's going on inside the graph and coverage across the various services. You want to flip over to my screen real quick?
Yeah, here, let's jump over to yours and take a look at it.
Yeah, so this is in the Graph Explorer. So just real quick, like I'm now down in the user segment. So I'm signed into a tenancy where I'm not an admin. I'm just a regular user. So I don't have rights to enumerate across all users. Like I don't have directory, read all, any of those kinds of things. So you can see, like, if I come in here and I look and I try and run one of these, it's actually going to fail for me. It's like, hey, permissions work. It's telling me you need to consent to the permissions. Very similar to what you had with the find command that you had earlier. If I go over to modify permissions here, this shows me all the various permissions that I may or may not need, depending on context and what I want to do in here. When I'm ready to do one of these, I go ahead and click consent. That takes me through the admin consent flow. I don't have the ability to do it, blah, blah, blah. It kicks me back out. So you can do all this stuff kind of on the Graph Explorer side of things too, if you want to, and that's kind of where you want to be. But the other thing here is if I just go kind of back to the top level Graph Explorer, like we'll reset our screen here. There's a bunch of getting started queries, which is fine. Like these are all hitting the API endpoints for the graph, but you can see just how much is covered. So within groups, what are the types of things that I can do with groups? So I can create a new group. I can list groups. I can remove group members. I can list a group's events. I can add a favorite group. All those kinds of things available to me. You see coverage for OneNote, for OneDrive, for Outlook. You had the whole user segment were in here, planners in here, searches in here. Hey, guess what? SharePoint sites and SharePoint lists are here as well. So I'm 100% with you on the take that, like, over time, as much stuff as can come into the graph, like even things like, dare I say it, Windows updates, back to that whole like device management thing. If it
Yep.
can be in the graph, somebody's going to find a way to put it in here for you. If you're using PowerShell, you're going to have to kind of know how to go through and discover the set of permissions associated with those various commandlets that you want to use. And in the case that a commandlet isn't available for the thing that you want to do, you're going to have to know how to do things like just invoke those REST commands through the graph commandlets. Like there's native commandlets within mggraph to invoke REST endpoints. Do gets, do post requests, things like that. You don't have to do just like a straight invoke web request kind of thing in PowerShell and figure out like the tokens and all that. But I think it's important that you recognize that this stuff is here too. And, these are the URIs you would use. These are the endpoints. What are the variables behind those various things that sit out there? But yeah,
Right.
this list used to be really small. Like I remember when Graph was first released and Graph Explorer first came out, and it was just some simple user stuff, and then it expanded into mailboxes and groups and users, and now it's just kind of got everything in there. It's got like a smattering of everything. It just can't do everything within a given segment, right? Like I can manage a user's OneDrive, but I can't manage the settings for OneDrive from an admin perspective. Like I still need to go and do that in other ways.
So what you're saying is I'm going to have to become a developer and understand all those REST endpoints.
I've been telling you this for a while, but yes, unfortunately, we are all developers now. I think understanding how to interact with and consume REST APIs, for better or for worse, is just something that we all need to know how to do. So if things like Git, post, patch, as HTTP methods sound like a foreign language to you, good place to go kind of spend some time, brush up, and learn a little bit more.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Like I was actually just looking too. What's going to be interesting is another module that's out there that has evolved over time, and it'll be interesting to see how these two merge together. Is PnP PowerShell. This started as essentially SharePoint Online PowerShell, and then it went to PnP dash PowerShell, I think. Now it's just PnP dot PowerShell. But that has 650 commandlets in it now across SharePoint Online, Teams, Project, Security and Compliance. They have Azure Active Directory commands in there. The PnP PowerShell is a community managed one, and I have this one up here too. I can pull this one up, but it's out there in GitHub PnP PowerShell. But I believe this is also built on all the REST endpoints. I'm not sure if is this using Graph in the background too for SharePoint for everything, or is it just invoking
Well, back to that, there's potentially
SharePoint
not coverage
endpoints
for everything
directly?
there. For what it can, things are transitioning over. There's other community projects that are also in that same transition phase right now. So maybe not exactly PowerShell, but the Microsoft 365 CLI is in the same boat. Transitioning over and getting to work with some of the newer Graph APIs.
Yeah, like to see even this all rolled into that Graph PowerShell would be interesting if those will merge together, if they'll stay separate, and this will continue to be community driven for maybe stuff that doesn't make it into the official Microsoft Graph. But you can even see here they tagged it with the Microsoft Graph API, Microsoft Graph. They're all going that way. And to your point, I was curious to see how many commandlets were out here. Oh, that's interesting. That usually works. I have broken PowerShell.
One wonders what
Microsoft
Microsoft
Graph
Draft
financials.
Financials is. Yeah.
Huh. Wonder.
Is that like that like feels like a Dynamics thing or something like that?
It does. I was
Microsoft.graph.financials. Get financials, get companies from financials, get financial accounts. I don't get it. What is a financial?
I don't know.
I know what Microsoft.graph.education is, .files is. Financials doesn't make too much sense to me, but what do I know? I'm just a lowly.
There's a lot of commandlets in there.
They've
built a lot of this out.
Ever growing, yes, yeah. The reference, like if you're going to do it this way, or you're going to go to like docs.ms and just go through the actual like PowerShell reference documentation, like what are the parameters within those parameter sets, what's required, optional, all those kinds of things. Like it's pretty expansive at this point.
There you go, Scott. 6,121 commandlets within that module. Well, and I guess it's technically a collection of modules because
it is.
Install Microsoft.graph is installing Microsoft.graph.files, .personalcontacts, .teams.
You get applications, bookings, calendar, that device management one. There's a cross-device experience one. There's one for cloud print. There's one for corporate management of devices. There's one for service announcements. That financials thing, whatever the heck that is. There's notes, people, contacts, planner, sites, which is SharePoint, Teams, users. It gets a little esoteric at times, right? You go from like Microsoft.graph.users to users.actions or users.functions, depending on what you're trying to do.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else related to at least getting started. like you said, there's a whole bunch of stuff we could dive into around.
I think the only other thing to like leave with, and I'll put you on the spot. If you know off the top of your head any good repositories of examples of transitioning existing kind of common admin tasks over. So I was kind of like talking about like license management in the beginning. I think that's a big one that probably everybody does. There might be things like setting basic user attributes, like anything like that. Is there like a good GitHub repo or a community managed thing, anything like that?
Not that I know of. Like you had said, there is. I was just looking because I know I've seen it. See, this is all going to the MSOL stuff again. I don't know of one off the top of my head. I know people have written stuff about it. I was just flipping through to see if anything jumped off. This is just going to go to that exact commandlet there.
All right.
Well, the article I saw. Yeah.
I'll point one out, and you'd flip over to my screen if you want, and we can kind of close out on that one. So I mentioned kind of Tony Redmond earlier. He's worked with a whole bunch of other MVPs, and they've got a book, Office 365 for IT pros. It gets updated monthly. Like, it's an awesome resource if you are an IT pro who works with Office 365. Like, I don't get a kickback or anything if you buy it, but like it's a book. It's published on Kindle. It comes out new version every month. It's updated.
Right. Well, and I think it's up to like 1,600 pages, isn't it? Like, it's not a small book. It's a massive amount of information.
It's an evergreen resource, like worth every penny if you do Office 365. But anywho, they have a GitHub repo. So go to github.com/12knox Inna, which is Tony Redmond's kind of Twitter handle and GitHub handle, all that, and then Office 365 IT pros. There's all of the kind of PowerShell modules that they've used as examples in their books, and they're not just book examples. Like I found many of these to be things that you can absolutely take over to the real world, and you can go ahead and use them, and they'll get to where they need to be. But you can do things like come in here and just search in this repository for graph, and you'll see where they've started to transition over to native graph endpoints for some of their examples, right? Like find tabs and apps and teams kind of thing. What are the endpoints they call? How do they do it? Like maybe not using the native graph PowerShell commandlets, but certainly the graph APIs. So you can kind of get hands-on with that a little bit as well. And maybe that's the way you want to go.
Got it. Yeah, that's probably as good a reference as I have. I'll be honest, I've been writing Azure AD PowerShell long enough that usually I just convert all my own stuff. So I don't, I'm not always looking for examples. I'm more... Yeah.
Find an example from somebody, just copy it straight off the internet, run it in my tenant,
So you're a true developer. Copy, paste,
works
run.
on my machine. Yeah, that's it. That's how we all do it now.
No, that is a good resource. I might have to look through here. I have not looked through his much, but he has he has a ton of stuff in here.
Yeah. It's all free. You don't have to buy the book, but you should totally go buy the book. Just buy the book. It's okay.
Just buy the book. Do people still read books, Scott?
On their Kindles, they do. Like I said, it comes out on Kindle or PDF. Like it's all fine. You can get hands on with it.
All right. Sounds good. Well, thanks for that resource. That is a good one. Yeah, sorry. You showed me up there. I did not have anything handy off the top of my head for that.
Here I was hoping, but next time.
All right.
Next time you'll have something.
Well, next time you get to pick a topic for us, I think. I decided to do this whole graph PowerShell thing. So be thinking, Scott, a couple weeks from now, 2-3 weeks when we do this again, what are we going to play with next?
Yeah, I'll go solicit some user feedback and we'll figure it out. But that being said, it is time to sign off. And looking at the clock, go to bed.
Go to bed, yeah. Right? Our wives are both going to roll their eyes at us and say, You were doing this for that long tonight?
Indeed.
Yep, only because Ben had issues with his computer. So go to bed, Scott. Enjoy your night, I guess, at this point in time. And we will talk to you in a few days when we record our next podcast episode as well.
Sounds good. Thanks, Ben.
All right. Thanks, Scott.